It's 3 in the morning, your baby is screaming, and somewhere in your sleep-deprived brain a genuinely unfair thought creeps in. Did cavemen actually have to deal with this? Surely ancient parents weren't pacing a dark hut at 3 a.m. Because wouldn't a screaming baby just attract every predator within earshot? It sounds like a reasonable theory, almost too clean, actually. And that should be your first clue that it's not quite the full story. Because ancient babies absolutely did cry. The far more interesting question isn't whether they cried. It's why the way they cried, and how often, might have looked completely different from the 3 in the morning meltdown you're currently surviving. Let's clear something up immediately, because it matters for everything that follows. Crying is not a cultural invention, and it's not something modern parenting somehow created or made worse. Infant crying appears to be a universal, hardwired human behavior, documented across every studied culture on Earth, with no known human population where infants simply don't cry. Researchers studying infant vocalization have proposed that crying likely evolved as what's sometimes called an honest signal, a behavior costly enough in energy and risk that it reliably communicates genuine distress or need rather than something an infant could easily fake. In other words, crying isn't a flaw in the system. It's the system working exactly as intended. A survival mechanism functioning in your living room tonight the exact same way it functioned in a shelter 40,000 years ago. So, if ancient babies definitely cried, where did this whole silent ancient baby idea even come from? And is there any real truth buried inside it? Here's where the actual research gets genuinely interesting, because there is real evidence for a meaningful difference, just not the one the popular myth describes. In 1986, researchers Urs Hunziker and Ronald Barr published a randomized controlled study in the journal Pediatrics, investigating whether increased physical carrying could reduce infant crying. Half the participating families were instructed to carry their infants substantially more throughout the day, regardless of whether the baby was currently fussing, while the other half followed typical care patterns. By 6 weeks of age, infants in the increased carrying group showed a dramatic reduction in crying and fussing, with some measurements showing roughly a 40% decrease in total crying duration compared to the control group. This wasn't about babies from one group having fundamentally different temperaments. It was the exact same starting population, split essentially at random, with the only meaningful variable being how much physical contact and carrying each infant received. Contact itself, it turns out, appears to be doing an enormous amount of quiet, underappreciated work in regulating infant distress. Now here's the part nobody talks about. Ancient infants, by virtually every reconstruction anthropologist can piece together, were receiving dramatically more of exactly that variable than most infants in industrialized societies today. Anthropologist Melvin Connor spent extensive time studying the Kung San, a hunter-gatherer society in the Kalahari, and his ethnographic research documented remarkably high levels of physical contact between infants and caregivers, with Kung infants carried in almost constant skin-to-skin contact for the vast majority of daylight hours, breastfed on demand in extremely short, frequent intervals, sometimes several times per hour, rather than on any fixed schedule, and responded to almost instantly at the first sign of fussing, often within a matter of seconds rather than minutes. This isn't a lifestyle choice modern parents could easily replicate while also, say, holding down an office job, and it's genuinely important not to romanticize it as simply better without qualification. But biologically and behaviorally, it represents about as close to a maximum contact, maximum responsiveness infant care environment as researchers have ever documented, and it lines up almost precisely with the exact conditions Hunziker and Barr's controlled study found reduced crying dramatically. Breastfeeding frequency specifically appears to play a distinct measurable role in this picture too, separate from carrying alone. Researchers comparing on-demand breastfeeding, nursing whenever an infant shows early hunger or distress cues, against scheduled feeding, nursing only at fixed, predetermined intervals regardless of the infant's immediate signals, have generally found that on-demand approaches are associated with reduced infant crying and fussing, likely because feeding itself, beyond simply delivering nutrition, appears to have a direct calming regulatory effect on infant physiological arousal. The Kung San's tattered Connor documented nursing bouts occurring several times per hour, often for just a few minutes at a time rather than infrequent larger feeding sessions, represents about as extreme a version of on-demand feeding as has ever been formally studied, and it lines up closely with the broader pattern already emerging from the carrying and responsiveness research. Frequent, low-latency responses to infant signals, across multiple different types of need, appear to consistently correlate with less overall crying, not more frequent parental intervention creating a more demanding or dependent infant, as some 20th century advice mistakenly assumed. This connects to another piece of research from the same Ronald Barr involved in the original carrying study, who later turned his attention specifically to cross-cultural comparisons of infant crying patterns. Barr's later research compared crying duration data from Western infants against crying patterns documented among the Kung San, and found that while both populations showed the same general developmental pattern, crying increasing in the first several weeks of life before gradually declining, a pattern so consistent across cultures it's sometimes referred to as the crying curve. The Kung infants in Connor's data showed meaningfully lower total daily crying duration throughout, without showing a fundamentally different curve shape. This detail matters because it suggests something reassuring rather than alarming. The underlying biological program governing infant crying appears to be the same universal human system in both populations. What differed wasn't the software. It was the environment that software was operating inside of, and specifically how quickly and consistently early distress signals got a response before needing to intensify. But wait, if constant contact and near-instant response really do reduce crying that significantly, why would evolution have bothered giving infants such a powerful crying reflex in the first place, if the ideal ancestral environment made that reflex almost unnecessary? This is where a concept from developmental psychology becomes genuinely useful. Crying likely didn't evolve as a constant, unavoidable baseline behavior, but as an escalating signal specifically designed to increase in intensity when initial, quieter distress cues go unanswered. Researchers studying infant communication have described a kind of graded signaling system, where infants typically begin with subtler cues, small movements, quiet fussing, specific pre-cry vocalization, before escalating to full crying if those earlier signals fail to produce a response. In an environment like the one Connor documented among the Kung, where a caregiver's body is in near constant contact with the infant and responds within seconds, an infant's distress signal may frequently get resolved at that earlier, quieter stage, never needing to escalate into the kind of sustained, full-intensity crying most modern parents are painfully familiar with. The crying reflex itself didn't disappear or weaken. The conditions that would normally trigger its most extreme expression simply occurred far less often. This escalating signal framework also connects closely to attachment theory, a foundational area of developmental psychology pioneered by psychiatrist John Bowlby beginning in the 1950s, who proposed that infants are biologically driven to maintain proximity to a caregiver, with crying functioning as one of several built-in behaviors, alongside clinging, following, and smiling, specifically designed to keep a caregiver physically close and attentive. Bowlby's research, along with extensive follow-up work by researchers like Mary Ainsworth studying infant caregiver attachment patterns directly, generally found that consistent, sensitive, and prompt caregiver responsiveness in early infancy is associated with more secure attachment patterns later in development, rather than the once popular but now largely discredited fear that responding quickly to crying would somehow spoil or excessively dependentize an infant. If anything, the research points in almost the opposite direction from that old assumption. Infants whose distress signals are met quickly and consistently tend to cry less overall. Not more, precisely because the system built to demand attention doesn't need to keep escalating when attention reliably, predictably arrives. Here's a pattern interrupt worth sitting with. Your baby's 3 a.m. meltdown might not be evidence that something's wrong with modern parenting. It might be the exact same ancient alarm system, just finally getting the chance to reach full volume, because nobody was already holding your baby directly against a warm chest when the very first quiet whimper started. One of the more visually striking demonstrations of exactly how sensitive infants are to caregiver responsiveness comes from developmental psychologist Edward Tronick's still face experiment, first conducted in the 1970s and replicated extensively since. In the experiment, a caregiver interacts normally and warmly with their infant for a period, then suddenly adopts a completely blank, unresponsive facial expression for a short time, offering no response to the infant's attempts to re-engage them. Across countless replications, infants respond to this brief loss of responsiveness with visible, rapid distress, escalating attempts to regain attention through vocalizing, reaching, and eventually crying, followed by clear relief and rapid recovery once the caregiver resumes normal, responsive interaction. The effect is fast, consistent, and remarkably strong, even though nothing physically dangerous is happening in the room at all. It's one of the clearest experimental demonstrations that human infants are exquisitely, almost instantly sensitive to caregiver responsiveness itself, independent of any actual physical need like hunger or temperature, which lines up directly with everything Hunziker, Barr, and Connor's research suggests about contact and crying more broadly. But wait, What about the specific danger a crying infant would seem to represent in a genuinely predator-filled ancestral environment? Wouldn't a loud, sustained cry in the middle of the night be an obvious, serious liability? The kind of thing natural selection would have strongly pressured against. This is a reasonable question, and it deserves an honest, appropriately careful answer, because it sits closer to informed speculation than firmly established science. Some researchers studying infant crying from an evolutionary perspective have proposed that predation risk could plausibly have contributed additional pressure toward rapid, effective infant soothing, on top of the purely developmental and attachment-based reasons already well documented. The logic is intuitive enough. In an environment with genuine nighttime predator risk, connecting back to research we've covered before on just how seriously ancient humans needed to manage nighttime safety, a group that responded to infant distress quickly and effectively, minimizing sustained loud crying, would plausibly have carried some survival advantage over a group that didn't. But it's important to be direct here. This specific predator avoidance angle remains a more speculative extension of the research, genuinely interesting but considerably less rigorously tested than the well-documented, repeatedly replicated findings on contact, responsiveness, and crying duration. The honest, well-supported core of this story doesn't actually need the predator angle to hold up. Contact and responsiveness alone appear to explain an enormous amount of the difference on their own. Modern clinical medicine has, in a way, independently rediscovered a version of this same principle in one of the more unexpected corners of hospital care. Kangaroo care, a practice involving prolonged continuous skin-to-skin contact between an infant, particularly a premature infant, and a caregiver, was first developed in Bogotá, Colombia in the late 1970s as a low-cost response to incubator shortages, and has since been extensively studied and adopted in neonatal care worldwide. Numerous clinical studies on kangaroo care have documented measurable benefits, including more stable infant heart rate and breathing patterns, improved temperature regulation, and reduced infant crying and distress compared to infants receiving standard incubator care without extended skin-to-skin contact. Some studies have also found associated reductions in infant cortisol levels, a hormone closely tied to physiological stress response, during and after periods of skin-to-skin contact. It's a genuinely striking modern echo of exactly the ancestral pattern this entire investigation keeps circling back to. A hospital, equipped with the most advanced medical monitoring technology available, ultimately finding that one of the most effective tools for calming a distressed infant is simply sustained physical closeness to another human body, the same tool available to every caregiver throughout most of human history, requiring no equipment at all. And the departure from high-contact, high-responsiveness infant care wasn't simply a passive drift that happened on its own. For a significant stretch of the 20th century, it was actively, confidently prescribed by professionals whose advice looks almost unrecognizable by today's standards. Psychologist John B. Watson, a highly influential figure in early behaviorist psychology, published widely read parenting guidance in the 1920s, explicitly warning against excessive affection, physical comforting, and responsiveness to infant crying, arguing that too much maternal warmth risked producing weak, overly dependent adults, and recommending scheduled feeding and minimal physical handling instead. Similarly influential childcare advice from figures like Truby King, whose methods spread widely across Britain, Australia, and New Zealand in the early 1900s, promoted strict feeding schedules and discouraged picking up a crying infant outside of those scheduled times, on the theory that consistency and routine mattered more than immediate responsiveness. This wasn't fringe advice. For a meaningful stretch of the early to mid-20th century, it represented mainstream, professionally endorsed parenting wisdom across large parts of the industrialized world, actively working against exactly the kind of rapid response, high-contact model that both ancestral evidence and later research, including Bowlby's, Ainsworth's, and Tronick's, would eventually show tends to reduce rather than increase infant distress over time. So where did the sharp departure from this high-contact, high-responsiveness model actually come from if it wasn't simply a gradual natural evolution in parenting styles over time? This is where the story takes a genuinely recent turn, and it has almost nothing to do with deep prehistory at all. Historian and infant sleep researcher James McKenna, who has spent much of his career studying mother-infant co-sleeping, has argued that solitary infant sleep, an infant sleeping alone in a separate space, is a remarkably recent cultural development in the broad span of human history, becoming widespread in Western industrialized societies really only over the past couple of centuries, closely tied to changing ideas about child independence, private bedrooms becoming more architecturally common, and shifting medical and cultural advice around infant care. For the overwhelming majority of human history, solitary infant sleep, separated from a caregiver's body for extended, unsupervised stretches through the night, would have been the genuine outlier, not the norm. What modern parents often experience as normal nighttime infant care, a baby alone in a crib, potentially in a separate room, checked on periodically rather than constantly touched, represents a fairly dramatic and historically very recent departure from the high-contact model that shaped human infant crying responses for the overwhelming majority of our evolutionary history. A Kung San infant, carried skin to skin through most of a daylight hour, rarely needs to escalate a quiet whimper into a full cry, because the response arrives before the signal ever needs to grow louder. A modern infant, placed gently in a crib in a separate room, monitored through a baby monitor rather than direct contact, has no choice but to escalate, because escalation is the only tool available to close a physical distance that simply didn't exist for most of human history. A randomized group of infants in a 1986 Montreal study, carried more for no reason other than a research protocol, cried measurably less within 6 short weeks, proving the difference wasn't about temperament, culture, or willpower, but about something as simple and physical as proximity itself. A parent standing in a dark nursery at 3 a.m., exhausted and quietly wondering what they're doing wrong, is very likely doing nothing wrong at all. They're simply operating inside a sleep architecture, a house, a culture that looks almost nothing like the one human infant crying responses actually evolved to expect. None of this means modern parents have failed by using cribs, separate rooms, or scheduled routines, and it's worth being clear about that, because guilt isn't a particularly useful takeaway from any of this research. Different environments carry different practical realities, safety considerations, and constraints that ancient caregivers simply didn't have to navigate, including modern safe sleep guidance developed specifically to reduce very real risks like sudden infant death syndrome. Guidance researchers, including McKenna himself, have worked to return rather than dismiss. What this research does offer is something more useful than guilt, a genuinely different lens for understanding why a crying infant, in a modern context, might respond so powerfully and so quickly to exactly the kind of contact, warmth, and rapid response ancient infants appear to have received almost constantly, almost as their evolutionary baseline expectation, rather than as an occasional soothing technique reached for only once things have already escalated. Which brings us back to that dark room at 3 in the morning. The exhausted parent, the screaming infant, the tempting, slightly bitter thought that ancient parents somehow had it easier. They didn't. Their babies cried too, because crying was never the problem evolution was trying to eliminate. But the world surrounding that cry looked almost nothing like yours, wrapped in constant contact, immediate response, and a caregiver's body rarely more than a few inches away at any hour of the day or night. Your baby isn't crying because something is broken. Your baby is crying exactly the way infant humans have always cried, reaching for a kind of instant, constant closeness that simply isn't built into the architecture of a modern nursery, the way it once was into the architecture of an ancient night. Ancient babies didn't cry less because they needed less. They cried less because they waited less.